The best foods for each organ in our body. Jumping right into it, let's start with the brain. The best foods that we can eat for the brain are going to be blueberries and walnuts. Now, we could get esoteric on all kinds of things, but when you look at the evidence, that's what I'm focusing on. Where does the evidence point? And with blueberries, you have these compounds called anthocyanins. These anthocyanins have the ability to cross through the blood-brain barrier and reduce oxidative stress specifically within the brain. But the interesting thing is that anthocyanins in things like blueberries and blackberries, these actually modulate neural signaling. So it can reduce the inflammation, ultimately making it so that neurons can signal to one another much clearer. That's why you can literally feel the effects of consuming something like blueberries relatively quick. Now, one of the ways they do this is they suppress what is called microglial overactivation. This is sort of the immune system within your brain. And when it becomes overactive, you have an overactive immune system, which means more inflammation, which means less neural signaling. So you think clearer, not to mention there's a longer term benefit too. Now we're seeing evidence that anthocyanins also increase what's called brain-derived neurotrophic factor. So you're actually increasing the amount of new nerve and neuron growth within the brain itself. Very fascinating stuff. Now let's talk walnuts for just a second. It's kind of funny because walnuts actually look like a brain, but the real reason that walnuts have a benefit isn't because of the polyunsaturated fats that are in them. A lot of times people point to that. It's another idea altogether. There's a study that was published in the journal Molecules, and it found that walnuts actually staved off cognitive impairment and reduced oxidative stress. It had more to do with phenolic compounds that are in the walnuts than the fats itself, because the jury is still out on whether polyunsaturated fats and things like walnuts actually have a positive benefit or a deleterious effect to the brain. Now, interestingly enough, there was an increase in synaptic and mitochondrial function in the brain. So the energetics of the brain changed, thereby lessening the stress load on the brain. It's pretty fascinating stuff. Now we're going to move into the heart. We're going to talk about foods that are specifically good for the heart. If you don't mind, please drop a comment down below in the comment section. It helps the algorithm. And if you watch my videos, just make it a habit of dropping a quick hello, quick comment, quick thank you, whatever you want to do. It helps the videos get out there. YouTube bases on engagement more so than views, which is kind of wild. Anyhow, on to the heart foods. The first one is avocados. Now, the main reason that avocados are so interesting is because of the oleic acid and the polyphenols that are in avocado. They actually reduce what's called oxidized LDL. Now, depending on who you talk to, you could get all mixed bag of different things. But when you look at the whole lipid hypothesis versus some of the other hypotheses on cardiovascular health, the one thing that we do know is problematic is the oxidation of the LDL itself. So whether or not the LDL cholesterol is truly problematic is maybe up for debate. But the oxidation and the macrophages and the foam cells that actually are created when there's inflammation and oxidation of the LDL, that's truly problematic. And that's where we see the benefit with avocados, reducing that oxidized LDL. Not to mention they're very high in potassium, which counteracts some of the sodium effects that people have when they're dealing with hypertension. So above all, avocados really do take the cake as a heart-healthy food, which flies in the face of some of the old stuff saying that high-fat foods are bad for the heart, even though we know in common newer age that avocados are not the same as, say, trans fats you're getting from fast food. Now, the next one is going to be organ meats for the heart. I know it sounds crazy, and if you don't want to eat organ meats, you could at least take either an organ supplement or a coenzyme Q10, CoQ10 supplement. Now, what CoQ10 is it's a mitochondrial cofactor. So it helps what's called the electron transport chain. It helps electrons that are taken out of our food when we eat them and passes them through a gradient to ultimately create energy. Now, when you have a more efficient energy system at a mitochondrial level, we got to remember that the heart has a high concentration of mitochondria. It is a muscle. So when you improve the energetics, you improve the power of the heart and thereby increase what's called the ejection fraction, the amount of fluid, of blood that the heart can actually pump out. Next, we move into the lungs. Which foods are best for the lungs? Now, with this, we look at pomegranates. There is interesting evidence suggesting that pomegranate extract can actually improve the lungs' resilience when exposed to cigarette smoke and environmental toxins. Not to mention, there's some interesting effects, as a side note, with green tea on reducing the overall collagen formation that could cause lung fibrosis. That's a story for another day. Let's come back to pomegranates. Pomegranates have these things called elagitannins. The elagitannins have been demonstrated in studies to protect against airborne toxins and airborne pollutants. Pretty wild. Now, the anthocyanins in pomegranates have a more systemic effect as well in terms of protecting against these toxins, but the elagitannins seem to really protect the actual airway itself and control and protect against toxins there, which is hugely fascinating. Now, the next one is more of a supplement, NAC, N-acetylcysteine. N-acetylcysteine is a precursor to cysteine, which is a precursor and a required compound for glutathione. Now, glutathione is very important for overall lung function and being able to thin the mucus. So that's why when sometimes you get a respiratory illness, people will tell you to take NAC. It thins the mucus and allows you to be able to expel and is somewhat of an expectorant. But at a low scale, when you're not feeling ill, you can take NAC and it actually helps kind of get that stuff out before it's ever really problematic. Let's move over to the kidneys now. The first food for the kidneys is parsley. Parsley contains something known as apigenin and apiol. These increase urine production. Okay, this is going to be somewhat of a diuretic effect at a very low scale, but it actually increases that glomerular filtration rate. So it increases the amount of things moving through the kidneys and ultimately out of the system. So this is a huge benefit, not only for people with hypertension because you're using a diuretic, but you're actually encouraging urine production. So increasing the amount of things moving through a system, which can actually reduce some negative effects. The second piece is one that we usually have linked to the urinary tract, which is cranberries, but cranberries have a direct impact on the kidneys as well. Cranberries have these things called proanthocyanins, and there was a study published in Phytochemistry that found that cranberry extract actually reduced the amount of adhesion of E. coli to the urinary tract. Now, what does that have to do with the kidneys? Well, if you have adhesions to the urinary tract, that backs up into the kidneys, right? So you've heard of people taking cranberry when they're having a UTI, but you can take it somewhat prophylactically to actually reduce adhesions and microbial adhesions that would back up and cause stress on the kidneys in the first place. Now, the other piece for the kidneys is just simply reducing high oxalate foods. When I had Dr. Jacob Torres on my channel, a kidney researcher up at University of California, Santa Barbara, he was so absolutely adamant that excess oxalates can contribute to crystals in the kidneys. So just reduce some of the foods that are high in oxalates. You could do a quick Google search for that. I also popped a link down below for Thrive Market. Almost everything I'm talking about, cranberry extract, coenzyme Q10, freeze-dried avocados to make it convenient on the go, you can get through Thrive Market. That's a 30% off discount link. I love these guys. Like the food quality, the nutrient quality, the ingredient list. It's so much better than what I typically find in a grocery store. Even living in California where grocery stores usually have decent quality food, I'm finding that Thrive Market has better, more affordable options. And that 30% off discount link gets you 30% off your entire first grocery order and a free $60 gift, and then it gets shipped right to your doorstep. I'm telling you, if you want ease of shopping and a good experience, I highly recommend it. So that link is down below in the top line of the description for 30% off your full grocery order. Okay, we're gonna talk skin for a second. People forget about tomatoes and the skin. Tomatoes have something called lycopene, okay? And lycopene particularly gets activated when it's cooked. So if you're stewing tomatoes or making your own sauce, you're gonna have a rich amount of lycopene. What lycopene does is it neutralizes singlet oxygens that are created by exposure to the sun. So these singlet oxygens that cause UV, quote unquote, damage, oxidative damage to the skin. So you can actually handle UV exposure better without the skin damage with fair amounts of tomatoes and lycopene. The lycopene also reduces the amount of collagen breakdown in the skin. So you're having less actual damage from the sun. It can literally make your skin look fresher, or at least avoid the damage that you would get from drying out your skin and breaking down the collagen. Now, the other thing that's wild is fatty fish, or an omega-3 supplement, really. I've talked about on this channel what is called membrane fluidity. So omega-3s help the cell membranes so they communicate better, and we always think of that on the inside of our body. But our skin cells have membranes too. So being able to have more membrane fluidity and flexibility by using omega-3s actually makes it so our skin stays fresher and is more resilient and more flexible and less wrinkles. And this is literally providing an additional protection from UV as well. So the UVA, the UVB, when you go outside, particularly the UVB, it's allowing you to synthesize that UVB into vitamin D better and having the pro-resolving mediators intact to prevent it from actually causing inflammation and damage to an extent. Now we're gonna move to the small intestine. Small intestine, we'll keep it simple, bone broth. Okay, glycine is one of the best things you can consume for the small intestine. It's a primary constituent of collagen. Okay, it's going to make it so that your gut lining is more preserved and your gut lining is protected. So you're actually taking care of that small intestine, not just the colon. Not to mention there's glutamine in it itself, right? Glutamine is the literal fuel for the intestinal cells. If they're not fueled with glutamine, they're not able to reproduce and actually repair. We forget that we deplete glutamine when we're stressed, when we're sleep deprived, when we're over-exercising, which a lot of us end up doing, at least collectively, either one of those or all of them combined. So bone broth is just such a simple, quick fix for the gut. Then we move into cooked garlic for the small intestine, which is really counterintuitive because raw garlic is problematic for the small intestine. But when you cook garlic, you release what is called allicin and some other sulfur-containing compounds. These have an antimicrobial effect in the small intestine and actually positively impact things like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. So it's kind of wild. If you had raw garlic, it can actually cause the growth of that. If you cook the garlic and have a small amount, the allicin can actually combat the bacterial overgrowth. Now we'll touch quickly on the liver. I've done other videos on liver food, so I'll keep this one relatively short, and we'll focus a little bit more on supplement. Okay, in this case, milk thistle really is legit. Here's an interesting study. This study was published in Biomarkers. They took a look at 40 humans and they gave them either a placebo, milk thistle seeds, or milk thistle leaves, or both. They found that across the board, the leaves and the seeds ended up decreasing oxidative stress significantly within the liver. So it decreased what's called malondialdehyde, which is a marker for liver stress and oxidative stress in the liver itself. And it increased the production of superoxide dismutase and glutathione. So believe it or not, the milk thistle is actually a little bit of a stressor that causes the increase of these internal antioxidants that overexceeds just neutralizing the milk thistle. It ultimately ends up protecting the liver. That's why it's known as a liver protectant. It really is legit. But that legitimacy is also one of the reasons why you never want to overdo it. That's why people recommend doing like 2 to 4 weeks of milk thistle and then coming off of it for an extended period of time. Use it when you need it. Okay, 2 quick things for the colon. I've done a lot of videos on the colon. One is Jerusalem artichoke. Not a regular artichoke, but Jerusalem artichoke. Jerusalem artichoke is very high in inulin, so you only need a small amount of it. It is a fructan that is one of the most potent prebiotic fibers that you could possibly have. And then we move over to kimchi. So kimchi, because the prebiotics, both the onion, the garlic, but also the fermentation and the probiotic effect, leads to particular increases in strains of bacteria that are associated with producing more mucin or more mucus. This mucus protects the gut layers, the gut lining, against lipopolysaccharides. So especially as we get older, we want to make sure we protect the gut barrier integrity. Now let's move over to the pancreas. And the pancreas has a lot of different functions. Okay, it's not just about helping us out with insulin and producing insulin. It's really doing a lot of things, digestive enzymes, you name it. But if we can take the pressure off those pancreatic beta cells and how they produce insulin, it can help a lot. So in this case, there's something known as Ceylon cinnamon. That's the kind you want to go for, none of the other ones. The Ceylon cinnamon doesn't have what is called a coumarin, C-O-U-M-A-R-I-N, I believe. Not like curcumin or not like cumin, but coumarin, okay? Now this is a compound that would completely null and void a lot of the benefits of cinnamon. So go for Ceylon cinnamon. What this does, Ceylon cinnamon mimics insulin. So it takes the pressure off the pancreatic beta cells by allowing the cells outside the pancreas to absorb glucose better so the pancreas doesn't have to produce as much insulin. This is hugely beneficial. Now the other piece of the equation is adding in something like berberine in a supplement form. Berberine increases what's called AMPK. So it's making it so that your cells sort of think you're in a little bit of a deficit, thereby allowing them to suck up glucose better. Berberine has been known by and large in the diabetic and the insulin resistance communities for a long time, but overall pancreatic health and reducing pancreatic inflammation is also important for people that aren't dealing with metabolic issues. Let's pivot over to hormones and thyroid for just a second. These might be ones that you know, so we'll touch on them briefly. They've been around a while. Brazil nuts, because of the selenium content. Selenium is absolutely 100 million% critical for the conversion of T4 into the active form of T3. Remember, T3 in its active form is what's going to send signals and genetic potential to regulate our metabolic rate and to make changes to our metabolism at the right times. Now, you're not gonna magically just lower thyroid and slow your metabolism. It's all kind of a cascade. But if you can make it so that T4 can convert into T3 effectively, then you can control your metabolism with food much smoother and much easier. Now, another food you wanna consume for the thyroid is something with iodine. So seaweed is usually a good one. Seaweed or kelp. And you don't need much, like one serving once a week provides you with enough iodine to actually produce the T4 and T3 hormones to begin with. Without iodine, you will not produce those. Now we roll into the reproductive system. We're gonna talk a little bit more on the hormonal side of this, more than anything, more than the actual organs or the testes or the ovaries themselves. But the first one is, believe it or not, flax. This is wild, because people think, well, flax, that's a hormone endocrine disruptor. Sort of, but not. You see, flax has these lignins that are broken down by the gut. And when these lignins are broken down by the gut, they actually produce these new compounds. These new compounds are called enterolactone and enterodiol. Okay, and these are estrogen mimickers that actually bind to the estrogen receptors and reduce the overall amount of estrogen that's binding. So even though it is an estrogen or a pseudoestrogen, this one is actually benefiting us. And we've seen it in the breast cancer research. It's actually beneficial for reducing estrogen levels. Tremendous for women in certain cases, definitely tremendous for men that might have high levels of estrogen. So it seems like it's an estrogenic food, but it's an estrogenic food that's actually combating estrogen from actually binding. Which leads me to the next food for men in particular case, oysters. Now, oysters can be an aphrodisiac for men and women, but for men, they've been studied for interesting peptides in them. There was a study published in Food Science and Nutrition. It looked at 3 specific peptides that are in oysters. Before, people used to just say, oh, it's the zinc increasing your testosterone. Zinc is great, and oysters are high in zinc, but no, it's these 3 particular peptides. These 3 peptides actually scavenge oxidative stress, allowing for more testosterone production by the Leydig cells. You're actually producing more because you're reducing the oxidative stress. Quite fascinating. Now, the last organ I want to focus on is one that I think we should all be paying attention to, because we focus so much on the liver for detoxification, but we forget about our friend the gallbladder. So our gallbladder produces bile, which emulsifies things and helps us get them out of the body. So what foods do we eat here? Bitter greens, things like arugula, things like dandelion, other bitter greens. It's the bitterness, right? So what's happening is quite unique. They actually activate bitter taste receptors, which are legit things in the gut. Now, when this happens, it releases something called cholecystokinin, CCK. And what CCK does is then it triggers the the gallbladder to constrict, to contract, and release bile. This actually has a positive feedback response where the gallbladder then starts to go through this process, so you can kickstart it. But eating a little bit of dandelion with some higher fat foods can encourage the contraction of the gallbladder, which actually allows it to release bile, keeps everything moving. Then we have beets, which are rich in betaine, also known as trimethylglycine. Really interesting here because this increases methylation. TMG is a methyl donor. So long story short, it increases something called methylation in the liver, which is absolutely critical and required for bile acid formation. To produce bile, we need this methylation to occur in the liver. Now, this bile acid synthesis then leads to more phase 2 detoxification, which allows the toxins themselves to bind to bile and release it out of the body. So there's a detoxification process, but then there's also just a flat out bile acid synthesis process. So people that have bile issues, sometimes they have an issue at the liver level, and sometimes they have an issue at the gallbladder level. Even without a gallbladder, you could still produce bile out of the liver. It's just not going into like a storage tank, so to speak. So as always, keep it locked in here on my channel, and I'll see you tomorrow.